Imagine, if you will, the pale hush of a medieval morning, the soft light seeping through linen shutters, casting long golden threads across a stone floor. A cockerel, somewhere far off, announces the dawn with proud insistence. In a modest chamber warmed by last night's embers, a figure slowly rises from their straw-stuffed mattress. Before them lies the business of dressing, a ritual both ordinary and quietly sacred. Yet something is curiously absent, something so deeply assumed by our modern selves that its absence seems almost unthinkable. Underwear, as we know it, had not yet found its comfortable home. Let us now gently wander into the daily dressing chambers of centuries long past, where linen shifts rustled and woolen hose were tugged with sleepy sighs, and where the curious question of what lay between skin and outer garment unfolded in ways far stranger than one might suppose. In the early medieval period, the idea of undergarments was both simple and, to our modern minds, surprisingly sparse. For men, the foundational garment was the braise, a loose, baggy affair, somewhat akin to very wide boxer shorts or short trousers, typically made of linen or, for the poor, rougher homespun fabrics. These were tied at the waist with a drawstring or belt, sometimes long enough to reach the knee or calf and worn beneath tunics. Linen, prized for its softness and absorbency, was the preferred material when one could afford it. Women, on the other hand, began their dressing with a long, flowing linen chemise, sometimes called a smock. This chemise was not underwear in the modern sense, but rather a barrier garment, protecting outer clothing from the body's oils and sweat. It reached to the ankles, loose-fitting and unadorned, and was often the only layer worn next to the skin. Modesty, in those days, was tied not to tightness or exposure, but to the presence of layers, of which this was the first and most necessary. But what of more intimate protection? Here, dear listener, the trail grows thin. There is scant evidence that medieval people wore anything akin to modern underpants. No briefs, boxers, or bras. Women, it appears, did not wear drawers at all for most of the medieval period. The idea of bifurcated garments for women was considered improper, masculine even. Instead, the chemise served all purposes. It absorbed, it concealed, it layered. And so, if a woman needed to attend to private matters, she need only lift her layers. There was a certain practical wisdom to this arrangement, especially given the complexity of dress in later medieval centuries, when a noblewoman might be bound in kirtles, girdles, and gowns. Simplicity, beneath it all, made the necessities of life more bearable. Let us pause now and picture a morning scene in a peasant's cottage. A woman stoops to tend the hearth, her chemise gathered under a coarse woolen overdress. She is not burdened by lace or elastic. Her garments breathe. The linen may be patched, but it is familiar, often made by her own hand or her mother's. She shifts easily in it, a second skin of habit and tradition. For men, the braise sometimes served as outerwear as well, particularly when working in the heat or at hard labor. A man might be seen in his hose and braise, tunic thrown over a shoulder, wiping sweat from his brow. Hose, those tight-fitting leg coverings, were often separate pieces in earlier centuries, tied to a belt or the braise themselves with laces called points. Only later did the hose merge into joined leggings. And for those wondering about support for the female form, well, here the record grows truly misty. There is evidence, from a few rare finds, such as the 15th century Lengberg castle textiles discovered in Austria, that some women may have worn garments resembling proto-brassieres, linen pieces with stitched cups, supportive in design. Yet, these were not common, nor widespread. Most women relied upon the natural support of youth or the freedom of age. A tightly laced kirtle or bodice provided some structure, but comfort and modesty were not measured in the same way they are today. Cleanliness, of course, came through the washing of linen. Chemises and braies were often the only pieces washed regularly, for the outer garments, made of heavy wool and difficult to clean, were brushed, aired, and carefully maintained. Thus, the underlayer bore the burden of contact, changed more frequently, and sun-bleached on lines strung between trees or rooftops. In towns, washerwomen labored with paddles and soapwort, their hands red with toil, their songs echoing across the rivers. In winter, one might wear 2 shifts, or stuff wool between layers. In summer, a single thin chemise served day and night. Night clothes were often the same as underclothes. A person might sleep in their shift, rise and don hosea and gown upon it. There was no need to change into something else entirely. Clothes flowed with the rhythm of life, not against it. One must not forget the influence of class. A nobleman's braies might be fine linen trimmed with embroidery, while a laborer's were coarse and plain. A noblewoman's chemise might bear lace at the neck or be perfumed with rose water. But beneath all this, the simplicity remained. A single layer of linen, a direct touch against the skin, and nothing more. Humorously, illustrations from the margins of manuscripts sometimes depict people in their underclothes as a form of embarrassment or folly. To be caught in one's braies was akin to being caught in a moment of vulnerability. In jest or moral lesson, the exposed undergarment became a symbol of human foolishness or shame. Even within the cloistered world of monasteries and nunneries, linen garments were the standard. Monks and nuns wore simple underlayers beneath their habits, long shirts of coarse cloth that served to protect both skin and robe. Rules dictated modesty and cleanliness, but baths were infrequent, and so the laundering of underlayers became both a spiritual and practical task. The sound of linen flapping on the line behind an abbey was as much a part of the day's rhythm as prayer and silence. In wealthier households, garments might be perfumed or kept in wooden chests with sprigs of dried herbs, lavender, thyme, or rosemary, to keep moths at bay and to lend a pleasant scent to the cloth. A fresh chemise, kissed by the sun and the faint tang of herbs, could be as refreshing as a bath. And though the undergarments of the age were simple, they were not without care. A bride might embroider her initials on her smock, or a mother might weave a hidden blessing into the hem. These garments, though hidden from the world, were closest to the body, and thus, in a way, closest to the soul. Linen worn thin by years of use bore the memory of the skin it had touched, a kind of quiet intimacy passed between generations. In times of travel, extra shifts were prized. A pilgrim might carry 2 or 3, rolled tightly and tied with cord, tucked into a bundle with bread, a flask, and perhaps a relic. Changing one's chemise at a shrine after days of dust and prayer was as much a spiritual cleansing as it was physical. The act of undressing and washing feet, of wiping the face and arms with cool water, brought a quiet peace to the journey. Among the many rhythms of medieval life, The ritual of dressing and undressing held a humble grace. There was no rush. One did not throw on clothes, but stepped into them with a kind of reverence. The chemise was not merely functional, it was the beginning of the day's character. Its feel against the skin, its scent, even its weight on the shoulders. These set the tone for the hours to follow. Imagine now, at day's end, a woman seated by the hearth, unpinning her veil and loosening the ties of her overdress. The day's dust falls away, and she draws on her night shift, a garment not so different from the one she wore all day, yet imbued with the softness of sleep. Her husband, already wrapped in a worn linen shirt, stirs the coals one last time. The room dims, the fire whispers, and the linen against their skin becomes the gentle threshold between waking and dreams. Thus, in the centuries before elastic and lace, before factory seams and fashionable labels, medieval folk moved through their days with the quiet grace of linen. Their undergarments were not declarations, but companions, unseen, essential, and endlessly practical. So now, as the hush of history enfolds us and sleep tugs softly at our thoughts, let us imagine one last image. A wooden chest at the foot of a bed, open to reveal neatly folded chemises, patched and scented with rosemary. The candle burns low, the linen waits, and the world of yesterday breathes its final sigh. Good night, dear listener. Good night.